Chosen one. There was a moment when something within you shifted quietly yet irreversibly, and that shift marked the awakening of discernment that had been forming beneath layers of emotion and confusion for far longer than you realized. You stopped reacting emotionally to every stimulus, every tone change, every subtle tension in the room, and instead began observing spiritually, stepping back internally before responding outwardly. Proverbs 4:7 declares that wisdom is supreme and therefore you must acquire it. And in acquiring wisdom, you are unknowingly acquiring sight beyond surface behavior. Where you once felt compelled to defend, explain, or appease immediately, you began to pause, watching patterns unfold without inserting yourself impulsively. That pause was not detachment born of apathy. It was maturity cultivated through experience and prayer, allowing you to evaluate motives rather than merely respond to moods. James 1:19 urges you to be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger. And that verse began to move from theory into practice within you. Emotional reactivity once clouded your discernment, yet as you surrendered, that reflex spiritual perception gained space to develop. You noticed that certain interactions followed predictable cycles, that certain conversations carried undertones inconsistent with their words, and that certain reassurances felt hollow despite polished delivery. This awakening was not dramatic, it was a progressive unfolding as layers of denial dissolved and clarity surfaced. The shift from emotional reaction to spiritual observation marked the beginning of your strategic exit, because once you could see clearly, you could no longer pretend confusion was innocence. As your perception sharpened, patterns became visible in ways that unsettled you at first, because what you once interpreted as care revealed threads of control woven subtly beneath it. You began recognizing manipulation disguised as concern, guidance presented as protection, yet functioning as restriction, and affection offered conditionally upon compliance. Matthew 10:16 instructs you to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves, balancing purity of heart with alertness of mind, and that balance was forming within you through painful recognition. What once felt like overthinking was actually discernment maturing, distinguishing between genuine support and subtle dominance. You noticed how certain words were repeated strategically to shape your perception, how guilt was introduced gently to influence your decisions, and how praise was withdrawn selectively to regain leverage. These realizations were not birthed from suspicion, but from accumulated evidence that your spirit could no longer ignore. Proverbs 26:24 warns that enemies disguise themselves with their lips while harboring deceit in their hearts, and though not every interaction was malicious, some were undeniably misaligned. The discomfort you felt was not paranoia, it was awakening, because truth often unsettles before it liberates. You began to observe tone timing and consistency rather than merely listening to promises, and those observations revealed discrepancies too frequent to dismiss. The clarity forming within you required courage, because once patterns are visible, responsibility to respond follows. What once entertained your trust now invited scrutiny, not to foster cynicism, but to cultivate wisdom. God sharpened your perception through pain, and though you would not have chosen that method, it proved effective in ways comfort never could have achieved. Psalm 119:71 declares that it was good to be afflicted so that the psalmist might learn God's decrees, revealing that suffering often heightened sensitivity rather than merely wounding it. The disappointment you endured, the betrayal you processed, and the confusion you wrestled with collectively refined your awareness, removing naivety without erasing compassion. Pain forced you to confront inconsistencies you once rationalized, to question narratives you once accepted without examination, and to evaluate whether peace accompanied certain relationships or whether tension was constant. Hebrews 5:14 speaks of mature believers whose powers of discernment are trained by constant practice, and your discernment was trained precisely through repeated exposure to complexity. You learned to sit with discomfort rather than suppress it, recognizing that internal unease often signaled misalignment rather than oversensitivity. What once felt like personal failure began to reveal systemic imbalance, shifting your focus from self-blame to pattern recognition. The sharpening process was not gentle, yet it was transformative, equipping you with clarity that cannot easily be manipulated. God did not waste your pain. He utilized it to recalibrate your internal compass, ensuring that future navigation would be steadier and more precise. What once wounded now instructs, and what once confused now clarifies. What once confused you began revealing itself clearly, as though fog gradually lifted from terrain you'd been traversing blindly for too long. Situations that once required extensive explanation now felt transparent because inconsistencies repeated too predictably to ignore. Romans 12:2 speaks of transformation through renewing of the mind, so that you may discern what is good, acceptable, and perfect, and that renewal was unfolding within you quietly yet powerfully. You began connecting dots you had previously viewed as isolated incidents, recognizing that repetition indicated intention rather than accident. Conversations replayed in your memory with new insight, and moments you once dismissed as minor now appeared as early warnings you had overlooked. This clarity did not inflate pride. It cultivated responsibility because seeing clearly demands action aligned with truth. You realized that confusion had often been sustained by your reluctance to confront reality, yet as courage increased, denial diminished correspondingly. The awakening reframed your past not to condemn you, but to educate you, showing that your trust was sincere even if misplaced. John 8:32 promises that the truth will set you free, and that freedom begins internally before it manifests externally. The clarity now guiding you is not accidental. It is the product of refinement, of prayer, of tears, and of willingness to confront what once felt too complex to unravel. So recognize this awakening as pivotal, chosen one, because discernment opened your eyes not to foster fear, but to establish freedom, not to create isolation, but to position you for alignment. You stopped reacting emotionally and began observing spiritually, allowing wisdom to interrupt reflex and patience to precede response. Patterns emerged where once there was only confusion, revealing manipulation masked as care and control disguised as love, yet exposing truth does not create darkness. It removes its concealment. Pain sharpened perception, transforming wounds into warnings and disappointment into discernment that now protects rather than paralyzes you. What once seemed inexplicable now appears coherent because your internal lens has been cleansed of distortion. Proverbs 3:21-23 encourages you to preserve sound judgment and discretion, so that you may walk securely and not stumble, and security now accompanies your steps more consistently. The awakening you experienced was not escape from reality, it was engagement with it at a deeper level, guided by spiritual intelligence rather than emotional impulse. You did not become colder, you became clearer, and clarity is compassion aligned with truth rather than confusion sustained by fear. This was the beginning of your orchestrated exit, because once discernment illuminated the terrain remaining unchanged would have required denying what God had already revealed, and you chose alignment over illusion, clarity over comfort, and obedience over approval as you stepped forward with eyes fully opened. Chosen one. There was a decisive shift in your posture when you chose silence over confrontation, and that decision was not weakness disguised as restraint, but wisdom exercising discipline under pressure. In earlier seasons, you might have felt compelled to correct every misrepresentation immediately, to challenge every inconsistency directly, and to defend your position with urgency whenever misunderstanding surfaced. Yet Proverbs 17:27 teaches that the one who has knowledge uses words with restraint, and a person of understanding is even-tempered, revealing that silence can carry intelligence deeper than argument. You recognize that not every battle requires vocal engagement, and that sometimes the most powerful response is patient observation rather than reactive speech. Ecclesiastes 3:7 reminds you that there is a time to be silent and a time to speak, and discernment lies in distinguishing between the two. By choosing silence in moments where confrontation would have escalated conflict, you were not surrendering your ground, you were gathering information. Silence became shield rather than surrender, allowing you to evaluate tone, pattern, and intention without clouding perception through emotional exchange. You understood that arguments often revolve around narratives crafted to provoke reaction, and refusing to engage disrupted the expected cycle. What appeared to others as passivity was in truth strategic positioning, because you were no longer playing within rules designed to exhaust you. Your silence was not empty. It was observant, intentional, and increasingly powerful. You allowed behavior to oppose itself rather than arguing with illusions, and this required restraint far greater than impulsive rebuttal ever demanded. There were narratives presented to you that sounded convincing on the surface, explanations that rationalized inconsistency, and reassurances that masked subtle contradictions, yet instead of dismantling them immediately, you watched patiently. Luke 8:17 declares that nothing is hidden, that will not be disclosed nor concealed, that will not be brought to light, and trusting that principle freed you from the urgency to expose what time would reveal. You realize that arguing against illusion often strengthens it, because confrontation can provide fuel for manipulation when clarity is not yet visible to all parties. By stepping back, you allowed patterns to unfold naturally, recognizing that repeated behavior reveals truth more clearly than isolated incidents. Proverbs 20:11 states that even a child is known by their actions, whether their conduct is pure and right, and actions ultimately speak louder than explanations. Instead of debating narratives crafted to distort perception, you observed consistency across time, measuring promises against outcomes rather than rhetoric alone. This approach required patience because exposure does not always happen immediately, yet patience preserved your energy and protected your credibility. When illusions eventually unraveled under their own weight, you did not need to argue for validation. The evidence stood independently. Allowing behavior to expose itself was not avoidance. It was strategic trust in truth's eventual visibility. You also began documenting patterns mentally, rather than reacting impulsively, and this mental discipline transformed confusion into clarity over time. Instead of dismissing discomfort as oversensitivity or attributing repeated tension to coincidence, you recorded internally what you observed, noting tone shifts or recurring excuses and cycles of behavior. Proverbs 4:25-26 urges you to let your eyes look straight ahead and to give careful thought to the paths of your feet, and careful thought requires intentional observation rather than impulsive reaction. By mentally cataloguing interactions, you built a framework for discernment that was evidence-based rather than emotion-driven. What once felt chaotic began forming recognizable sequences, and recognizing sequence dismantled confusion because unpredictability gave way to pattern. You resisted the urge to confront prematurely, understanding that one isolated moment can be explained away, but repetition cannot be dismissed so easily. James 1:19's call to be slow to speak and slow to anger became practical strategy rather than abstract principle, because slowing your reaction created space for analysis. The discipline of observation sharpened your discernment, enabling you to differentiate between genuine misunderstanding and intentional manipulation. Instead of reacting to isolated sparks, you assessed the fire's origin and trajectory, ensuring that your response would be proportionate and informed. Your mental documentation did not cultivate suspicion. It cultivated wisdom, transforming scattered impressions into coherent insight. Through observation, you transitioned from being emotionally entangled in situations to understanding them structurally. Your quietness also made others underestimate you, and though that may have felt uncomfortable initially, it ultimately worked in your favor because underestimation concealed your strategy. Proverbs 22:3 notes that the prudent see danger and take refuge, while the simple keep going and pay the penalty. And prudence often operates quietly rather than theatrically. When you chose not to react dramatically, some interpreted your composure as ignorance, assuming that your silence indicated unawareness rather than evaluation. Yet underestimation granted you space to observe, without interference to gather clarity, without triggering defensive adjustments from others. You were not announcing your insight, you were refining it, allowing time to confirm what intuition suggested. 1 Peter 3:15 instructs believers to be prepared to give an answer, with gentleness and respect, and preparation often occurs in silence before articulation. Because you did not reveal every observation immediately, you retained strategic advantage, responding only when clarity solidified, rather than when emotion surged. Underestimation reduced resistance against you, because those who assume superiority often relax vigilance, revealing more than they intend. Your quiet posture became camouflage for wisdom, developing beneath the surface, and when you eventually acted, your action carried weight because it was grounded in evidence rather than in assumption. Silence positioned you to respond decisively rather than react defensively, and that distinction elevated your influence. So understand this transformation clearly. Chosen one, because silent observation becoming strategic power marks a significant evolution in your maturity and authority. You chose silence over confrontation not out of fear, but out of foresight, recognizing that restraint can yield greater clarity than immediate rebuttal. You allowed behavior to reveal itself rather than wrestling with illusions crafted to provoke, trusting that truth surfaces when patterns repeat. You documented mentally rather than reacting impulsively, converting confusion into structured insight and emotion into informed response. Your quietness led others to underestimate you, yet that underestimation shielded your discernment until timing aligned with action. Psalm 46:10 commands you to be still and know that God is God, and stillness is not stagnation, but awareness rooted in trust. The power forming within your silence is not aggressive. It is grounded, patient, and deliberate, reflecting spiritual intelligence rather than emotional volatility. What once might have erupted into argument now matures into strategy, and what once felt like vulnerability now functions as advantage. Your silence did not diminish your strength. It refined it, transforming reactive impulse into calculated clarity. Silent observation has become strategic power, ensuring that when you speak or move, your actions emerge from alignment and wisdom, rather than from urgency, positioning you not as one who escapes conflict impulsively, but as one who exits strategically with insight fully developed and authority quietly established. Chosen one. There was a season when your emotions felt like immediate commanders issuing urgent directives the moment betrayal, disappointment, or disrespect touched your heart. Yet something profound has shifted within you, and emotional mastery has replaced emotional reactivity. You still felt every betrayal deeply, because sensitivity is not weakness, and compassion does not disappear with maturity, yet you did not explode in the way you once might have. Proverbs 29:11 teaches that a fool gives full vent to their anger, but the wise bring calm in the end, and wisdom began governing your responses even when your heart was stirred. The sting of injustice did not vanish, but it no longer dictated your behavior automatically because you learned to pause between feeling and action. In that pause, clarity found space to breathe, and a prayer interrupted impulse before words could escape prematurely. Ephesians 4:26 instructs you to be angry and yet not sin, acknowledging that emotion itself is not transgression but unmanaged reaction can be. You experienced anger, grief, and shock, yet you allowed those emotions to pass through reflection rather than erupt through retaliation. The difference was not numbness, it was governance, as though your spirit rose above the storm of feeling to evaluate consequences before expression. Emotional mastery did not silence your heart, it disciplined it, ensuring that pain did not distort purpose. What once might have become dramatic confrontation transformed into measured discernment shaped by restraint. You cried privately while thinking strategically, and that combination of vulnerability and wisdom marked growth that few could see but heaven fully recognized. Psalm 56:8 declares that God collects your tears in his bottle and records them in his book, reminding you that your private grief was neither unseen nor dismissed. In solitude, you allowed yourself to feel the weight of betrayal without minimizing it, acknowledging the hurt rather than suppressing it, yet you refused to let sorrow dictate your next move impulsively. You processed your pain in prayer, analyzing patterns even as tears fell, because clarity often emerges when emotion is honored but not obeyed blindly. Instead of broadcasting your distress publicly, you chose sacred spaces for release, protecting your dignity while preserving your strategy. Proverbs 25 compares the purposes of a person's heart to deep waters, yet understanding draws them out, and you were drawing out understanding from your own depths rather than reacting from surface agitation. This private processing strengthened your discernment because you separated the event from the interpretation, ensuring that your response aligned with truth rather than with wounded pride. Jesus himself withdrew to lonely places to pray during intense seasons, as Luke 5:16 records, demonstrating that retreat for clarity precedes decisive action. You were not retreating in fear, you were recalibrating in wisdom, ensuring that when you acted it would be deliberate rather than defensive. Emotional mastery does not eliminate tears. It ensures that tears do not become tactics for others to exploit. You learn to separate what you felt from what you decided, and that distinction reshaped the architecture of your leadership and identity. Feelings once blurred into decisions, causing reaction to masquerade as conviction, yet Romans 12:2 calls for transformation through renewal of the mind, so that discernment guides choices rather than impulse. You recognize that emotion communicates valuable information, but does not always prescribe appropriate action, and that realization marked the beginning of internal governance. You could feel betrayed yet choose restraint, feel anger yet choose patience, feel hurt yet choose composure, because you understood that decisions carry consequences beyond the moment of feeling. James 1:20 reminds you that human anger does not produce the righteousness of God, and righteousness requires alignment beyond emotional immediacy. Separating feeling from decision allowed you to evaluate outcomes long before speaking or moving, ensuring that your choices reflected strategy rather than momentary relief. You no longer sought the catharsis of venting if it compromised future positioning, because you valued long-term alignment over short-term validation. This discipline strengthened your authority as others began to perceive steadiness rather than volatility in your presence. Emotional mastery does not suppress authenticity. It refines exhaustion so that integrity remains intact under pressure. The clarity born from separating emotion and decision elevated your maturity significantly, transforming you from reactive participant to strategic responder. God also gave you peace in chaos so that you could move wisely, and that peace was not denial of reality, but supernatural stabilization amid turbulence. Philippians 4:7 promises that the peace of God which surpasses understanding will guard your heart and mind in Christ Jesus, and guarding implies active protection rather than passive comfort. While conflict swirled and uncertainty intensified, you felt a quiet steadiness beneath the noise as though divine composure anchored your internal world. That peace did not remove complexity, yet it prevented complexity from overwhelming you completely, allowing reason to function where panic once dominated. Isaiah 26:3 assures that God keeps in perfect peace those whose minds are stayed on Him, and staying your mind required intentional focus amid distraction. The calm you experienced confused some observers who expected visible agitation, yet your tranquility was evidence of trust rather than indifference. You were not detached from the situation, you were anchored within it, moving thoughtfully rather than erratically. Peace became strategic advantage because chaos often tempts others into impulsive errors, while composure preserves clarity. Proverbs 3:5-6 instructs you to trust in the Lord and lean not on your own understanding, promising that He will direct your paths, and that direction became clearer when panic receded. Emotional mastery allowed divine peace to guide timing, ensuring that your exit was orchestrated rather than explosive. So recognize this transformation as profound, chosen one, because emotional mastery replacing emotional reactivity marks elevation in both spiritual authority and personal integrity. You felt betrayal fully yet refused to explode destructively, demonstrating strength through restraint rather than through retaliation. You cried privately while thinking strategically, honoring pain without surrendering wisdom and allowing God to collect tears that did not need public display. You separated feeling from decision, ensuring that action aligned with long-term calling rather than short-term emotion, and that separation fortified your discernment. God granted peace in chaos, not as escape but as equipment enabling you to move wisely where others might have faltered impulsively. Galatians 5:22-23 lists self-control as fruit of the Spirit, and that fruit matured within you precisely through tension rather than through ease. Emotional mastery does not diminish humanity. It dignifies it, aligning sensitivity with strategy and compassion with clarity. What once might have been explosive confrontation became calculated transition, preserving dignity and positioning simultaneously. The calm you carried was not indifference. It was disciplined strength under pressure, evidence that spiritual intelligence had matured beyond reactive impulse. Emotional mastery has become part of your authority, ensuring that future conflicts will encounter a leader who feels deeply yet responds wisely, whose heart remains tender yet whose decisions remain anchored, and whose composure reflects not suppression but sovereignty, under the guidance of a God who stabilizes the inner world before directing the outer path. Chosen one, before you ever stepped away, before you altered your position or redirected your path, you built certainty internally with deliberate patience because you understood that movement without conviction invites regret later. There was a time when impulse might have propelled you forward prematurely, yet this season demanded deeper verification, and you honored that requirement with discipline. Proverbs 14:15 warns that the simple believe anything, but the prudent give thought to their steps, and you became prudent through observation rather than reaction. You gathered evidence internally so that doubt would not drag you backward once distance was established, recognizing that unresolved ambiguity can weaken resolve. Instead of relying on one emotional moment or one painful incident, you evaluated patterns across time, measuring consistency rather than reacting to isolated sparks. Luke 14:28 speaks of counting the cost before building, ensuring that foundation precedes construction, and you applied that wisdom to your departure. You knew that once you moved, you would need clarity strong enough to withstand nostalgia, pressure, and second-guessing. Certainty was not born from stubbornness. It was constructed through repeated confirmation, prayerful reflection, and disciplined restraint. You refused to let temporary emotion dictate permanent decisions, understanding that irreversible moves require irreversible conviction. The foundation you built internally ensured that when you finally acted, you would not be vulnerable to manipulation or guilt-driven reversal. You confirmed patterns rather than assuming them, and that distinction separated wisdom from suspicion because discernment relies on evidence rather than on projection. There were moments when discomfort surfaced, when your spirit felt unsettled by interactions that seemed inconsistent, yet instead of labeling them immediately, you watched for repetition. Proverbs 18:13 cautions against answering a matter before hearing it fully, declaring it folly and shame, and you resisted premature conclusions in favor of patient evaluation. You observed tone timing, follow-through, and alignment between words and actions, allowing data to accumulate rather than forcing interpretation. This approach protected you from reacting to miscommunication, while simultaneously guarding you from ignoring systemic misalignment. Hebrews 5:14 describes mature believers whose discernment is trained by constant practice, and your discernment matured precisely because you practiced observation over impulse. You did not allow isolated moments to define your perception. You required consistency before drawing conclusions, and consistency eventually revealed what assumption alone could not confirm. The patience required to confirm patterns strengthened your resolve because evidence rooted in repetition cannot be easily dismissed. You were not seeking validation for suspicion, you were seeking clarity for alignment, ensuring that your decision would be grounded in reality rather than in reaction. By confirming patterns deliberately, you built conviction that would remain stable even under external pressure. You also allowed time to expose contradictions, recognizing that truth often surfaces gradually rather than instantaneously. Psalm 37:7 encourages patience before the Lord and warns against fretting when others seem successful in their ways, and patience became your ally in discerning authenticity. Contradictions that once felt subtle became unmistakable when given space to unfold, because inconsistency rarely sustains itself without revealing fracture. Instead of confronting prematurely and providing opportunity for adjustment or concealment, you stepped back and allowed behavior to repeat naturally. Time has a way of amplifying what is hidden, as Luke 8:17 affirms that nothing concealed will remain undisclosed, and trusting that principle freed you from the urgency to expose discrepancies yourself. You noticed how narratives shifted depending on audience, how promises adjusted according to convenience, and how explanations multiplied when alignment was absent. Each contradiction added another layer of confirmation, not fueling bitterness, but strengthening clarity. Ecclesiastes 8:5 teaches that the wise heart will know the proper time and procedure, and waiting allowed you to discern both. By giving time permission to reveal truth, you protected your credibility because your departure would not be based on conjecture but on demonstrated inconsistency. The contradictions exposed themselves without your interference, validating your perception and solidifying your internal decision. You ensured that your exit would not be impulsive but irreversible, and this required courage greater than dramatic confrontation because irreversible movement demands unwavering internal alignment. Matthew 5:37 teaches that your yes should mean yes, and your no should mean no, and you knew that once you declared your no, it must stand firm without oscillation. You examined your motives carefully, ensuring that frustration did not masquerade as conviction, and that ego did not disguise itself as righteousness. James 1:5 promises wisdom generously to those who ask, and you sought that wisdom repeatedly, before acting unwilling to confuse temporary fatigue with permanent misalignment. You rehearsed the potential consequences, internally anticipating emotional backlash, misunderstanding, and attempts at persuasion, fortifying your resolve before those pressures materialized. This preparation ensured that when resistance came, you would not interpret it as new information, but as confirmation of why departure was necessary. You did not want to exit in anger only to return in regret, so you built such comprehensive clarity that return would contradict truth rather than relieve loneliness. Proverbs 24:6 affirms that victory comes through many advisors, and you counseled yourself through scripture and prayer until alignment was unmistakable. Your exit became irreversible, not because you hardened your heart, but because you clarified your conviction beyond manipulation. Movement grounded in certainty withstands emotional waves, and you prepared for those waves before stepping into open water. So recognize the strength in this process. Chosen one, because building certainty before moving reflects spiritual intelligence rather than indecision. You gathered evidence internally so that doubt could not reclaim authority later, confirmed patterns, rather than assuming them allowed time to reveal contradictions and ensured that your departure would be anchored in truth rather than in emotion. Proverbs 3:5-6 urges trust in the Lord rather than reliance on personal understanding, promising that He will direct your paths, and that direction unfolded gradually through observation and patience. Your certainty was not impulsive confidence. It was constructed conviction, shaped by discernment and reinforced through prayer. The irreversible nature of your movement reflects preparation rather than defiance, demonstrating maturity rather than reaction. You did not flee confusion. You exited clarity, and clarity is far more stable than frustration. What others may interpret as sudden was in reality the culmination of months or years of internal verification. The strength of your exit lies in the foundation beneath it, because once truth solidifies through repeated confirmation, retreat becomes betrayal of revelation rather than restoration of comfort. You built certainty before you moved, ensuring that your steps forward would not tremble under pressure, but remain anchored in the clarity God patiently allowed you to construct through disciplined observation and unwavering commitment to alignment. Chosen 1. The timing of your departure was not accidental, and it was not impulsive. It was the product of strategic patience refined through restraint and guided by discernment that matured quietly beneath the surface. You did not move at the height of emotion, even though there were moments when frustration tempted you to act immediately, because you understood that premature exits often create unnecessary vulnerability. Ecclesiastes 3:1 declares that there is a season for everything and a time for every purpose under heaven, and you waited until your internal season matched the external necessity. Patience was not passive endurance. It was active preparation, ensuring that when you moved, you would not be reacting but responding. You recognized that haste might satisfy temporary emotion, yet compromise long-term stability, and so you chose to wait until dependency decreased significantly. The waiting was not weakness, it was calibration, aligning your strength with your step. Proverbs 19:2 warns that desire without knowledge is not good, and whoever makes haste with their feet misses their way, and you refuse to miss your way through urgency. You allowed clarity to mature until doubt no longer held leverage, ensuring that your decision would withstand pressure once enacted. Strategic patience is rarely applauded publicly, yet it is often the invisible force that perfects timing beyond what impulse could achieve. Your delay was not hesitation, it was refinement. You waited until dependency decreased, understanding that leaving, while entangled emotionally or practically, would only replicate the same patterns in a new setting. Emotional dependency once blurred discernment, making distance feel like loss rather than alignment. Yet over time, you cultivated independence grounded in identity, rather than in external reassurance. Psalm 62:5 reminds you to find rest in God alone, because your hope comes from Him, and that truth gradually shifted your reliance from human validation to divine affirmation. Financial dependency also required attention, because wisdom demands stability before transition. And Proverbs 21:5 teaches that the plans of the diligent lead surely to abundance, but haste leads only to poverty. You secured practical foundations, carefully ensuring that your movement would not be constrained by avoidable insecurity. Spiritual dependency matured as well, transforming from seeking confirmation for every decision into resting in conviction shaped by prayer and scripture. You did not want to leave merely because you felt wounded. You wanted to leave because you were ready. Dependency decreased, not through denial, but through discipline, as you strengthened areas that once required support before stepping into independence. This reduction of dependency fortified your confidence, making your departure sustainable rather than reactionary. By waiting until reliance shifted from circumstance to conviction, you ensured that your exit would reflect strength rather than desperation. You also secured emotional, financial, and spiritual stability, intentionally recognizing that stability creates leverage in transition rather than vulnerability. Emotional stability meant processing hurt fully so that bitterness would not accompany you into the next season, because Hebrews 12:15 warns against allowing a root of bitterness to spring up and cause trouble. You faced your emotions honestly, prayed through disappointment, and released resentment gradually so that your departure would not carry unresolved anger. Financial stability required discipline and foresight, because wisdom anticipates future needs rather than reacting to crisis impulsively. You strengthened boundaries, evaluated resources, and ensured that your next step would not collapse under practical strain. Spiritual stability deepened through consistent communion with God, anchoring your identity so firmly in truth that external approval became optional rather than essential. Isaiah 26:3 promises perfect peace to those whose minds are stayed on Him, and that peace became your internal compass. Stability in these areas created alignment, allowing you to move without fear of collapse or regret. Your preparation was not rooted in fear but in foresight, because foresight honors calling more than impulsive courage ever could. By securing these foundations, you transformed departure into advancement rather than escape. Stability became the invisible armor that ensured your next season would not repeat the vulnerabilities of the previous one. You did not leave in anger, you left in clarity, and that distinction defines the integrity of your exit more than any external explanation ever could. Anger once tempted you to confront, to expose, or to dramatize the shift, yet clarity whispered that composure carries greater authority than spectacle. James 1:20 reminds you that human anger does not produce the righteousness of God, and righteousness requires alignment rather than emotional release. When you finally moved, your tone was steady, your explanation concise, and your demeanor calm because you were no longer negotiating internally. Clarity had replaced confusion, and conviction had replaced volatility, enabling you to articulate your position without hostility. Proverbs 16:23 notes that the heart of the wise makes their speech judicious and adds persuasiveness to their lips, and your speech reflected that measured wisdom. You were not escaping conflict, you were concluding alignment, and that composure preserved dignity on both sides. Leaving in clarity allowed you to retain peace rather than regret, because your decision was not rooted in wounded pride but in confirmed misalignment. The absence of anger confused some observers, yet that calm was evidence of maturity rather than indifference. Clarity is quieter than rage, yet it is far more powerful in sustaining irreversible decisions. The timing was precise because God was aligning unseen details beyond your immediate perception, weaving circumstances together in ways you could not have orchestrated alone. Proverbs 16:9 states that a person plans their course, but the Lord establishes their steps, and your steps were established through synchronization rather than spontaneity. Conversations shifted at just the right moment, confirmations arrived subtly, and internal convictions solidified precisely when external conditions stabilized. What seemed like delay earlier now revealed itself as divine coordination, ensuring that resources, clarity, and opportunity converged simultaneously. Romans 8:28 assures that all things work together for good for those called according to His purpose, and that cooperation often unfolds invisibly before it manifests visibly. You were not merely waiting for courage, you were waiting for convergence, and convergence occurred when alignment reached maturity. The unseen details included not only practical arrangements but spiritual reinforcements, strengthening your resolve quietly before announcement. God's orchestration ensured that your move would not depend solely on personal strength, but on divine timing that minimized unnecessary disruption. What others perceived as sudden was in reality synchronized precision, shaped by months of internal preparation and divine calibration. Strategic patience perfected the timing, and the timing reflected orchestration rather than escape, confirming that your departure was not reactionary, but aligned with purpose unfolding beyond what human perception alone could comprehend. Chosen one. When the moment of movement finally arrived, the execution of your departure was clean, measured, and final, not because you lacked emotion, but because you had already processed it thoroughly before acting. There was no dramatic speech crafted to wound, no emotional outburst designed to shock, and no final confrontation staged to validate your pain publicly, because your clarity had matured beyond the need for spectacle. Proverbs 17:28 teaches that even a fool is thought wise when silent and discerning when not to speak, preserved your dignity more effectively than any eloquent farewell could have. You did not need to narrate your suffering for others to understand it, because the decision itself communicated what words might have distorted. Ecclesiastes 3:7 reminds you there is a time to speak and a time to be silent, and in this moment silence carried more authority than explanation. The absence of drama did not mean absence of depth. It meant that your conviction was settled internally rather than performed externally. You chose composure over catharsis, understanding that closure does not require chaos to feel legitimate. The steadiness of your exit protected your peace and prevented unnecessary escalation, because clarity had already concluded what emotion once debated. Your restraint did not diminish the seriousness of your decision, it strengthened it, ensuring that your final movement reflected strategy rather than reaction. The execution was clean because the preparation had been thorough, and thorough preparation rarely requires theatrical endings. No bridges were burned in the process because you understood that boundaries enforced with dignity preserve integrity better than bridges destroyed in anger. Romans 12:18 urges you as far as it depends on you to live at peace with everyone, and you honoured that instruction without compromising your conviction. You did not retaliate with exposure, nor did you attempt to dismantle reputations in order to justify your exit, because your goal was alignment, not vindication. Boundaries were established quietly, yet firmly signalling that access had changed, even if hostility had not erupted. Proverbs 4:23 commands guarding your heart diligently, and guarding sometimes requires distance rather than debate. By refusing to burn bridges, you left room for God to handle justice, trusting that Psalm 75:7 reminds you that promotion and demotion belong to Him rather than to human maneuvering. You recognize that destroying connection through rage would tether you emotionally to what you were meant to leave behind. Instead, you enforced boundaries that prevented further erosion of your peace, maintaining composure while protecting your future. There was no need for spectacle because your decision spoke clearly enough and silence prevented unnecessary entanglement. The bridges remained intact structurally, yet access across them was restricted by wisdom rather than by resentment. You walked away under divine composure, and that composure was not self-manufactured, but cultivated through prayer, reflection, and spiritual anchoring long before the exit occurred. Isaiah 26:3 promises perfect peace to those whose minds are stayed on God, and that peace governed your demeanour when departure unfolded. Observers may have expected visible agitation, assuming that departure must reflect visible distress, yet your calm confounded expectation. You were not suppressing emotion, you were stewarding it, allowing peace to guide your steps, rather than permitting chaos to dictate your tone. Philippians 4:7 speaks of peace that surpasses understanding guarding your heart and mind, and that guarding became evident in how steadily you moved. Your composure communicated that this was not impulsive rebellion, but resolved alignment, not retaliation but repositioning. There was strength in your quiet posture because strength does not always roar. Sometimes it walks away without announcement. Jesus himself, when accused unjustly, often answered little and maintained composure under pressure, demonstrating that authority does not require volume to assert itself. By walking away calmly, you preserved your narrative from distortion, refusing to give drama power over destiny. Divine composure elevated your departure from emotional reaction to strategic advancement, signaling maturity beyond what words could convey. By the time they realized you were gone, you were already beyond reach, and this distance was not geographical alone, but emotional and spiritual. You had processed grief before leaving detached dependency, before moving, and reconciled uncertainty before announcing. So when departure occurred, it was not a negotiation, but a conclusion. Proverbs 13-20 notes that walking with the wise makes one wise, and wisdom sometimes requires quiet departure rather than prolonged explanation. Attempts to revisit the conversation or to reopen dialogue found no traction because your conviction had solidified beyond persuasion. You were not unreachable out of bitterness. You were unreachable out of alignment, having stepped into a space where regression would contradict clarity. Luke 9:62 reminds you that no one who puts their hand to the plough and looks back is fit for the kingdom of God. And looking back emotionally would have compromised forward obedience. By the time awareness of your absence registered externally, your internal shift had long been complete, ensuring that re-entry was neither tempting nor feasible. Distance became protection, shielding your peace from reconsideration fueled by nostalgia. You had crossed a threshold internally, and thresholds crossed in conviction are rarely recrossed in confusion. The finality of your movement reflected preparation rather than defiance, demonstrating that you did not drift away gradually, but stepped away decisively. So understand the significance of this clean and final execution, chosen one. Because how you exited reveals as much about your growth as why you exited. There was no dramatic speech because your clarity required none, no emotional outburst because the emotion had already been processed privately, and no bridges burned because boundaries were sufficient. You walked under divine composure, carrying peace rather than resentment, and that composure preserved your authority. By the time others recognized the shift, you were beyond reach, not out of pride, but out of purpose, anchored in conviction that no longer required external validation. Psalm 37:23-24 assures that the steps of the righteous are ordered by the Lord, and that even if they stumble they will not fall, because the Lord upholds them with his hand, and your step was upheld rather than destabilized. The absence of drama did not minimize the weight of your decision, it magnified its maturity. Clean execution protects future alignment, because chaos at departure often contaminates new beginnings. Your exit was not theatrical, it was tactical, not explosive, but precise, and that precision reflects the depth of preparation that preceded it. What you closed was closed with dignity, and what you stepped into was entered with clarity, ensuring that the finality of your movement would stand firm, not because of stubbornness, but because of conviction shaped through patience, discernment, and divine guidance that orchestrated every detail of your departure. Chosen one. Once you stepped away with composure and clarity, something powerful began unfolding that required none of your intervention, because God himself assumed responsibility for exposure in ways far more precise than confrontation could have achieved. You did not have to defend your name repeatedly, nor did you need to rehearse your narrative publicly to secure understanding, because Proverbs 22:1 reminds you that a good name is more desirable than great riches, and God guards what he values. There may have been moments when you felt tempted to explain every detail, to clarify every misunderstanding, or to correct distorted accounts, yet restraint preserved your dignity while heaven orchestrated revelation. Psalm 37:6 promises that God will make your righteousness shine like the dawn and your vindication like the noonday sun, and that promise requires trust in timing rather than urgency in reaction. You chose silence over self-justification, believing that truth has endurance that argument lacks. Instead of exhausting yourself in defense, you allowed space for reality to reveal itself, naturally confident that integrity sustained over time would speak louder than accusation. What you once felt compelled to prove became unnecessary, because exposure does not require the participation of the falsely accused when God governs outcomes. Your peace remained intact not because you were indifferent, but because you trusted divine oversight more than personal defense. By stepping back, you made room for God to step forward, and his methods are rarely rushed yet always effective. The absence of your rebuttal did not weaken your position. It strengthened it, because silence in confidence communicates trust rather than fear. Without your presence quietly holding things together, dysfunction that once hid behind your stability began surfacing in undeniable ways, and this unfolding was not dramatic spectacle but gradual unraveling. There were structures you reinforced unknowingly through patience, gaps you filled through emotional labor, and conflicts you diffused through composure. Yet once you withdrew, the absence of your stabilizing influence revealed underlying imbalance. Ecclesiastes 10:3 observes that folly reveals itself even in simple conduct, and without your mediation, the fragility of certain systems became visible. You'd been absorbing tension, smoothing friction, and compensating for inconsistency, yet when you left, the weight shifted to those unprepared to carry it responsibly. The dysfunction that once appeared manageable began escalating, because your quiet strength had masked weaknesses others did not address. Proverbs 26:26 warns that malice may be concealed by deception, but its wickedness will be exposed in the assembly, and exposure often accelerates when stabilizing forces are removed. You did not need to dismantle anything, you simply ceased reinforcing what was misaligned, and misalignment revealed itself without assistance. What once seemed functional now appeared fractured, because the glue that held it together had quietly departed. This was not revenge, it was revelation, because truth surfaces when artificial support withdraws. The unraveling confirmed what your discernment had already recognized long before departure. Masks began slipping naturally as well, because maintaining illusion requires effort, and when the audience most attentive to inconsistency exits, performance loses its motivation. Luke 12:2 declares that nothing concealed will remain hidden, and nothing secret will not be made known, and that promise unfolded gradually in your absence. Behaviors once moderated under your watch became exaggerated without accountability, revealing attitudes previously disguised as cooperation. Words that once sounded measured began exposing underlying motives, because the discipline imposed by your presence no longer constrained expression. You did not need to expose hypocrisy. It surfaced under its own weight when consistency could not sustain performance. Proverbs 12:19 teaches that truthful lips endure forever, but a lying tongue lasts only a moment, and endurance ultimately favors authenticity. As time passed, contradictions that once required careful interpretation became obvious even to those who had doubted your perception. The slipping of masks was not orchestrated by confrontation, but by absence, because your withdrawal removed the incentive to maintain false harmony. Illusions unravel when the one who sees clearly is no longer present to absorb their tension. The exposure felt quiet yet undeniable, confirming that you had not imagined the inconsistencies that troubled you. What you once observed privately became visible publicly, and validation emerged not through argument but through unfolding evidence. Vindication unfolded without your involvement, and that unfolding carried greater authority precisely because it was not engineered by you. Romans 12:19 instructs you not to take revenge but to leave room for God's wrath, trusting that justice belongs to Him and leaving room requires restraint even when explanation feels justified. As contradictions surfaced and dysfunction escalated, those who once questioned your departure began reassessing events with new perspective. You did not campaign for sympathy, nor did you seek to convert opinion through persuasion, because time itself became witness. Psalm 135:14 affirms that the Lord will vindicate His people and have compassion on His servants, and vindication often unfolds incrementally, rather than dramatically. Conversations shifted subtly, acknowledgements emerged quietly, and clarity spread without your participation, because truth does not require amplification when it stands independently. Your absence spoke in ways your presence never could have, revealing that stability had been undervalued until it was removed. Vindication felt less like triumph and more like confirmation, reinforcing that your discernment had been accurate and your exit justified. There was no celebration of exposure, only a quiet recognition that God had handled what you released. The unfolding validation strengthened your peace rather than inflating pride, because you recognized that divine justice operates with precision beyond human orchestration. So understand the depth of this season. Chosen one, because God handling exposure after your departure reveals His commitment to your integrity and His sovereignty over narrative. You did not defend your name endlessly, because heaven defended it more effectively than argument ever could. Without your presence stabilizing dysfunction, imbalance surfaced naturally and masks slipped under the weight of inconsistency. Vindication unfolded without your manipulation, affirming that your silence was not weakness but trust. Isaiah 54:17 promises that no weapon formed against you shall prosper, and every tongue that rises against you in judgment you shall condemn, not necessarily through rebuttal, but through revelation. Your composure positioned you for peace, because you refused to entangle yourself in battles God intended to resolve independently. Exposure did not require your voice. It required your absence, and absence revealed what presence concealed. The justice unfolding was not dramatic spectacle, but steady confirmation, reinforcing that alignment often precedes revelation. You're not responsible for managing perceptions indefinitely. You're responsible for walking in integrity consistently. God handled what you released, and that handling confirmed that your exit was orchestrated. Your silence strategic, and your vindication secured not through argument but through the steady unfolding of truth under divine oversight that required no participation from you to accomplish what only He could reveal fully in His appointed time. Chosen one, the most undeniable evidence that your departure was orchestrated rather than impulsive is not found in what happened around you, but in who you have become since stepping away, because transformation itself has become the proof. You are no longer the same person who entered that situation, not because time passed automatically, but because pressure reshaped your perspective and refined your internal structure. 2 Corinthians 5:17 declares that if anyone is in Christ, they are a new creation, and the old has passed away, and that renewal is not abstract but experiential, visible in how you now think, respond, and discern. The person who once tolerated confusion in the name of loyalty has matured into someone who values clarity in the name of alignment. The version of you who once sought approval through accommodation has evolved into someone anchored in identity rather than in affirmation. What once unsettled you no longer destabilizes you, because your foundation has shifted from emotional dependency to spiritual conviction. You do not view yourself through the same lens, nor do you measure situations by the same criteria, because refinement altered your perception profoundly. The change within you is not cosmetic, it is structural, affecting how you interpret behavior, how you establish boundaries, and how you steward peace. Transformation is not always announced publicly, yet it radiates subtly through composure and discernment. The fact that you would not re-enter that dynamic under the same conditions reveals that growth has occurred beyond surface resilience. Pain refined your strength in ways comfort never could have accomplished, and though you would not have chosen that path voluntarily, It proved effective in building endurance that now anchors you firmly. James 1:2-4 instructs you to consider it pure joy when facing trials, because the testing of faith produces perseverance, and perseverance must finish its work so that you may be mature and complete. The disappointments you endured stretched your capacity to endure without retaliating, to remain composed when misunderstood, and to persevere when validation was absent. Strength matured not through dramatic confrontation, but through repeated restraint as you processed hurt without allowing it to define your identity. Psalm 66:10 speaks of God refining his people like silver, and silver is purified through fire that removes impurity without destroying substance. The heat you felt was not intended to consume you. It was designed to clarify what was authentic within you and what required release. You learned to withstand tension without collapsing, to absorb frustration without projecting it outward destructively. The resilience forming inside you now functions instinctively, stabilizing you when pressure reappears in different forms. Pain did not make you rigid, it made you resilient, reinforcing flexibility grounded in wisdom rather than in fear. What once felt like emotional fragility has evolved into steady strength capable of withstanding complexity without losing clarity. Betrayal sharpened your discernment in ways that no amount of theoretical instruction could have achieved, because lived experience imprints lessons more deeply than observation alone. Proverbs 27:6 notes that wounds from a friend can be trusted even when painful, and betrayal forced you to evaluate not only others, but your own boundaries and expectations. You examined patterns more carefully, distinguishing between intention and impact, and learning to recognize inconsistency before it escalated. Hebrews 5:14 describes mature believers whose powers of discernment are trained through practice, and your discernment was trained through navigating relational complexity without surrendering integrity. You no longer interpret charm as character or consistency as coincidence, because repetition revealed what words concealed. This sharpening did not create suspicion. It cultivated awareness, allowing you to engage with empathy while maintaining discernment. You can now sense subtle shifts in tone, detect misalignment beneath reassurance, and respond proportionately rather than react impulsively. Betrayal stripped naivety without erasing compassion, balancing wisdom with grace in ways that feel stable rather than cynical. You have not hardened, you have clarified, distinguishing between trust earned and trust assumed. Discernment sharpened through betrayal now protects your peace, rather than imprisoning your heart. You evolved into someone unavailable to dysfunction, and that unavailability is not arrogance but alignment, because you recognize that a participation in misalignment compromises destiny. Romans 12:2 calls you not to conform to the patterns of this world, but to be transformed through renewal of the mind, and renewal altered your tolerance for chaos disguised as normalcy. What once felt manageable now feels misaligned, and what once required explanation now requires distance. You no longer negotiate your boundaries to preserve access, because access that demands compromise is no longer attractive. Proverbs 13:20 reminds you that walking with the wise makes one wise, and you now evaluate proximity, carefully prioritizing alignment over familiarity. Dysfunction once relied on your accommodation, yet you are no longer available to absorb imbalance for the sake of harmony. This shift has recalibrated your environment, because unavailability to dysfunction reduces its influence automatically. You're not isolating yourself, you're selecting alignment intentionally, ensuring that your energy is invested where growth is mutual. The transformation within you has altered your availability, and availability determines influence. You've evolved beyond tolerance of confusion, beyond justification of inconsistency, and beyond accommodation of disrespect. So understand the depth of what has occurred. Chosen one, because transformation itself stands as proof that your journey was not accidental but formative. You are not who you were when you entered that dynamic, because pain refined strength, betrayal sharpened discernment, and clarity redefined boundaries. 1 Peter 5:10 assures that after you have suffered a little while, God Himself will restore, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. And establishment is evident in your steadiness. The growth you carry now is not theoretical, it is embodied in your posture, your tone, and your decisions. What once entangled you cannot recapture you, because transformation has altered your reflexes and your responses. You are unavailable to dysfunction not out of superiority but out of alignment, recognizing that destiny requires stewardship of peace. The proof of orchestration is not found in external validation alone, but in internal evolution, that cannot be reversed easily. You do not need to defend your departure repeatedly, because who you have become testifies more convincingly than any explanation. Transformation has become the evidence that the fire refined rather than destroyed that betrayal, instructed rather than embittered, and that your evolution positioned you beyond the reach of what once confined you, confirming that your movement was not escape but advancement into a stronger, wiser, and more aligned version of yourself under divine guidance. Chosen One, understand this with unwavering clarity. Your exit was not emotional collapse, it was divine graduation, a completion of curriculum that had already refined you beyond that environment's capacity to contain your growth. You did not abandon responsibility. You advanced into alignment, stepping forward because your calling required space that compromise could no longer provide. Isaiah 43:18-19 declares that you must forget the former things because God is doing a new thing. And the closing of that chapter was not loss but transition into promise prepared long before conflict surfaced. What tried to break your confidence ultimately became the very pressure that strengthened your discernment, transforming opposition into acceleration. Genesis 50-20 reminds you that what others intended for harm, God can turn for good, and your breakthrough emerged precisely from the tension designed to confine you. You are no longer who they once understood you to be because refinement reshaped you into the version God prepared for expansion rather than containment. The door is closed permanently, not in bitterness but in completion, and the new season has already begun unfolding under divine orchestration that does not require permission to proceed. Heavenly Father, thank you for guiding my steps even when I did not understand the full strategy. Thank you for sharpening my discernment and strengthening my resolve. Help me never return to what you delivered me from. Guard my heart from doubt and regret. Confirm my freedom with peace that cannot be shaken. I trust that my exit was not escape but elevation. In Jesus' name, amen.